Cinemassacres Monster Madness, a tribute to Roger Corman. When it comes to Roger Corman horror films, there's nothing that stands out more than the Poe series. It was a series of films based on the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. In total, there were 8 of them made between 1960 and 1964. And there were 9 if you count The Terror. I've already sort of reviewed the Poe series in the first Monster Madness back in 2007, but it was only a short installment in a 31-part history of horror. I barely said much about them. So I knew this year, doing a tribute to Corman, of course I was going to review one of these movies in depth, but the question was, which one? All of them have a place in my heart, as I absolutely love gothic horror. I couldn't single out one without talking about the rest, so fuck it, I'm doing the whole thing. I've rewatched them all right before writing this review and forgot just how much I love them. You get first-rate performances from Vincent Price and other horror actors from the classic era. You get a certain degree of humor mixed with the macabre. You get these wonderful haunted set designs with candles, archways, and old portraits on the walls. You get this spooky photography with foggy cemeteries and handcrafted matte paintings. And you are told the stories of Poe in a digestible, entertaining way. While Poe is a household name in horror and his stories are such well-known staples, they can be quite awkward to read. The wording is very old-timey and the stories can be vague, having a dreamlike logic that in cinema can only be interpreted as a nightmare come to life. In Corman's book, he mentions that he was reading a lot about Freudian psychoanalysis at the time and was very interested in the inner workings of the psyche. He decided he wanted to use Freud's theories to interpret Poe. He also had sessions with a psychiatrist who helped him learn to analyze the connection between humor and horror. So I'd say the Corman Poe series has something for every kind of horror fanatic. Morbid, but with comedy, lavish, but psychological, gothic and atmospheric like the black and white Universal classics, but in color. It's also worth noting that the cinematography in most of the series was by Floyd Crosby, who was the father of David Crosby of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Also notable is that Richard Matheson, who wrote I Am Legend and a number of Twilight Zone episodes, was the screenwriter on half the Corman Poe films. But now, let's get into the films. It all kicks off with House of Usher, and this is the one that needs to get discussed the most because it sets all the rest in motion. If you've read the story, Fall of the House of Usher, you'll notice that the film takes some liberties, but overall is a pretty straightforward adaptation, probably the closest and most faithful of all the Poe films. It's about a guy, Philip, who shows up at an old, isolated mansion. He's played by Mark Damon, who I just happened to find out, like Corman, passed away this very year. He was 91 and died on May 12th. So this video can be in remembrance of him too. Philip's reason for arriving at the house is to meet up with his fiancée, Madeline. We get the impression he's been away for a long time, so why he suddenly shows up out of the blue, who knows? But Madeline's brother Roderick, played by Vincent Price, wants to stop them from marrying. His reason is because he's dying of a rare disease that makes him ultra-sensitive to light, sounds, and all sensations. The problem is that the disease is hereditary, so Roderick is afraid that Madeline would pass it on to future children.
3/4 of my family have fallen into madness.
So to him, his family is doomed and must have no lineage, to the point where he knowingly buries Madeline alive, and this is where some of the morbid humor comes in.
Because I do not believe that for the Ushers there is peace hereafter.
The character is so hopelessly miserable, so full of doom and gloom and negativity all the time, that eventually you have to laugh.
Is there no end to your horrors? None whatever.
Quite a downer, isn't he? We never know for sure if his disease is real or it's psychosomatic, but the details and facts don't matter as much as the atmosphere and the overall experience. At times, the film even slips into these surreal nightmare scenes. It's really a trip. And this is where the Freudian aspect comes in, as Corman wanted the movie to work on a subconscious plane as it depicts the final decline of Roderick's sanity. This was AIP's first big production of this kind. Instead of two low-budget black and white films, they decided to combine the budget and make a big color CinemaScope production. Corman says in his book that the budget was $270,000, though it most likely went over at $300,000. It was a gamble for the company, and Corman at the time was known for making monster movies. Sam Arkoff of AIP asked Corman, "Where's the monster?" And he replied, "The house is the monster." In Corman's book, he says in order to get the film made, he had to add a line in there.
"The house itself is evil now."
And sure enough, the house does feel like it has a mind of its own. It has this big crevice running through it from the foundation, getting wider and wider, like a giant mouth getting ready to swallow the last of the Usher family. It is the house that takes them down in the end.
There was no other way. No other way.
The film turned out to be a huge success and took Corman to all new heights. It's not only a great success story, it's also a lesson in economy filmmaking. With only 15 days to shoot, they made the most of it. They chose to adapt a simple story. They used few locations, minimal sets, minimal actors, and very little effects. Art director Daniel Haller bought stock sets from Universal for $2,500, so all the columns, arches, and windows were reconfigured and recycled. For each film, they would buy more, while still using the old ones. So this would keep increasing the look of the production design. It's kind of like if you buy some Halloween decorations, you keep them for next year, but then you buy some more, and each year it keeps getting better and better. During production, Corman heard on the radio that there was a forest fire in the Hollywood Hills, which is always a very awful and unfortunate situation. However, it came at the benefit of the movie because after the fire had been put out, it left the ground gray with ash and all the trees were charred black. So all they had to do was bring in some fog machines and they got a good spooky forest out of it. And it played into the whole story how the house has this aura of death all around it. For the final scene, when the house burns and collapses, they found an old barn that was about to be demolished. Corman offered the owner $50 to burn it down as opposed to just knocking it down, and to burn it at night with 2 cameras rolling. He got so much footage out of it, he was able to not only use it in House of Usher, but subsequent Poe films as well. He says in his book, he didn't know anybody would ever notice it was the same footage being recycled until VHS came along and people could compare. For any of the scenes with interior fires, they would lather the walls in flammable gunk, which would keep it from destroying the walls, but it would still burn the paint. So if they needed a second take, somebody would have to repaint it while they would go shoot something else because there was no time to waste. The production of House of Usher has a great message behind it. It's a testament to what you can do under the limits of schedule and budget when creativity prevails. The follow-up, Pid and the Pendulum, had all the markings of a cash grab. It could have easily been a pale imitator, but it manages to surprise. The production design is even better. It's fun to let your eyes explore and get immersed in that scenery. There's many long stretches where he's going through cobwebs and shit. This is classic horror in a nutshell. The plot was largely invented for the film because if you've read Pid and the Pendulum, you'll know it's just a guy locked in a cell and who's eventually strapped down underneath a swinging blade that keeps coming closer and closer. The movie uses the Poe story as its final act, but leading up to it, they had to invent new stuff, which feels like a repeat of House of Usher. A guy is wandering along the shore when he comes to a matte painting of a castle. That matte painting ended up being recycled in a lot of films, but that closer shot of the castle, that one, that's the famous shot that ended up being recycled in The Premature Burial, The Raven, The Terror, and even Deathstalker 2, Deathstalker 3, and probably a bunch of other films. As far as I know, Pit and the Pendulum must be the first appearance of what I call the Corman Castle. I seem to be the only person who ever talks about it or cares. So anyway, this guy shows up to the castle looking for his missing sister when he meets her husband, played by Vincent Price.
Who are you?
You can see why I think these films are so similar. It's all just knock knock, who's there, Vincent Price. He claims the sister died of a disease, and he has the same type of sobbing monologue while looking at portraits on the wall and speaking of how the whole place has this atmosphere of death.
Breathing this infernal air, absorbing the miasma of barbarity which permeates these walls.
It's the same type of formula, though Vincent Price approaches it with a different angle, which is a great testament to his acting abilities. Even though it's written in that same grief-stricken way as Roderick Usher, his delivery keeps it fresh and doesn't come off like he's playing the same character as before. In the castle's dungeon, there's a bunch of leftover old torture devices. There's a backstory about how his father was an agent in the Spanish Inquisition, which ties it to the Poe story. The facts become blurred as the convoluted past comes to light. It starts to become apparent that he killed his wife and even thinks that she is coming back to haunt him.
I must accept whatever vengeance Elizabeth chooses to inflict upon me.
As we hurtle towards the final act, Vincent Price's performance really shines and goes through many changes. At times, he's very subdued, almost catatonic, but soon he will be exploding with energy. After a long stretch where he's exploring the tomb, he encounters what he thinks to be his dead wife, and after falling down some stairs, he starts laughing uncontrollably. His sanity has been completely destroyed. It's the moment when Price wins over the entire movie, but it only gets better. It turns out he was a victim of an elaborate ploy to drive him insane, and when he learns that, he goes full fucking psycho. Oh man, this is when shit gets good. He turns the tables and becomes the vengeful maniac that his father was.
I thought the two of you would enjoy the novelty of it.
You are about to enter hell, Bartolome. Hell!
He uses the pendulum to torture in this elaborate matte-painted dungeon with disturbing wall murals. The over-the-top villainous acting, the wicked monologues, the camera angles and editing make this one of the greatest horror sequences of the 60s. I first thought this was just a pale imitator of House of Usher, but this final act changed my mind completely. I think it may even surpass it. Though whether it surpasses Bela Lugosi's performance in the 1935 version of The Raven is up for debate. Third in the series was The Premature Burial. Corman made this one outside of AIP because of a dispute, and because Vincent Price was locked into an exclusive contract with them, he couldn't be in this one. It's very unfortunate because if Price was in this one, it could have been one of the best. Oddly enough, it later became an AIP film as they bought the distribution rights. The plot, once again, has the theme of being buried alive, and that's because there are so many Poe stories that have this theme. The film sticks close enough to the original story about a man who has an irrational fear of being buried alive. His fear leads to a condition where he randomly falls into a narcoleptic sleep that resembles death. His worry is that somebody will bury him before he wakes up.
The rigid embrace of the coffin, the blackness of absolute night, and the silence.
So he creates this elaborate tomb with all these contraptions that he can survive off of, or to call for help, or to ingest a poison in case it all doesn't work out. It's a pretty terrible thought. The highlight for me is all the cemetery sets. I am a sucker for a good foggy cemetery, and there is plenty of it to look at. You almost feel like you can breathe in the night air. I can't get enough of this shit. When it comes to atmosphere, this film has it. What it doesn't have is Vincent Price, and there's plenty times where the character is giving a monologue, and I just can't help but imagine Vincent Price's voice and face on top of his. Still though, he does a good job. The actor is Ray Milland. He's one of those actors whose filmography is so massive that if you look him up, you'll get his bio, but then the filmography will be its own separate page, broken into eras, TV, film, etc. He's best known for The Lost Weekend, 1945, in which he won the Academy Award for Best Actor, but I know him best as the main character in Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder. That was a good one. Overall, Premature Burial might be kinda forgettable compared to some of the others, but it still has that cozy, classic vibe. Fourth in the series is Tales of Terror. If you ever decide to watch these movies in a row, like I just did, and you're feeling any Poe fatigue by the time you get to number 4, rest assured, this one will rejuvenate your interest. It's an anthology film made up of 3 short segments, which seems like it would have been the best approach all along, since Poe typically wrote short stories and poems. The first segment is Morella, which feels like the same old playbook, but the great acting and awesome set design keep it appealing, and the short format probably helps too. Vincent Price, once again, is living alone in some secluded mansion or castle when somebody comes knocking on the door. In this case, it's his daughter Lenora, who is not welcome. He hates her because his wife died while giving birth to her, and he blames her for it, which is absurd. He treats her like shit for no reason.
I went into your nursery and I took you out of your cradle and I almost hurled you out of the window.
There is so much conviction in Price's acting that it almost becomes comedic. Like, what is his problem? This father is an asshole. And why does she stick around? He even keeps the mother's corpse on a bed. I mean, that's not normal. And it reaches the same kind of horrific crescendo as House of Usher, even reusing the burning barn footage, but for some reason, nothing feels stale. I guess they went with the mentality of, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. The second segment is The Black Cat. Holy hot damn, this is the pinnacle. Even though it strays from the Poe story, I'd say there is no doubt this is the best segment and one of the highlights of the whole Corman Poe series. I give all the credit to horror veteran Peter Lorre. The moment he enters, it takes the series into a new uncharted territory.
Keep that beast away from me!
He plays Montrezor, an angry, bitter alcoholic who is very cruel to his wife and her cat. Night after night, he takes her money to go to the local bar to get plastered.
How dare you throw me out!
But the scene that makes the whole movie is when he crashes a high-class wine tasting party. At the head of it is Vincent Price. It's another testament to his versatility that he can play 3 characters in the same movie and it never feels like the same guy. Here, rather than being a depressed recluse, he's a jolly, social, well-established, and sophisticated champion wine taster named Fortunato.
Pinot Noir, Burgundy.
If you've noticed their names come from another Poe story, Cask of Amontillado, well, there's a reason. But first, Montrezor challenges Fortunato to a wine tasting competition, which at first seems like a joke.
You coward! You poser! I say call the police!
But Montrezor surprises everybody with his knowledge. The two come from such different walks of life. Fortunato takes small sips and he sucks the air and makes all these silly faces, while Montrezor just chugs everything that's handed to him.
Burgundy, Volnay, 1832, and...
Regardless of his method, he knows his wine, and Fortunato is impressed. After all said and done, they respect each other. They walk out the bar drunk together as equals. It's kind of charming to see them become friends. It's a really great scene, and it's probably the best competitive drinking scene since Vincent Price and Basil Rathbone drunk it out in Tower of London in 1939. But things take a turn when Montrezor finds out that Fortunato's been banging his wife, so he lures him with some good wine and bricks him up behind the wall.
Oh, for the love of God! God, Montresor.
Yes. For the love of God.
So it sort of combines The Black Cat with Cask of Amontillado. I mean, Poe was so obsessed with characters being entombed in a wall or under a floor or buried alive in a coffin that it just seemed natural to combine them. The third and final segment, The Case of M. Valdemar, I think is the weakest, though it does reunite Basil Rathbone with Vincent Price. Price, as Valdemar, is dying of a painful illness and enlists the help of a hypnotist, Rathbone, to put him into a trance to escape the pain.
I will let you go when I am finished.
But instead, the hypnotist traps his soul and tries to move in on his wife.
Well, now you shall be my wife. I shall not ask. I shall take what I desire.
But in the end, Valdemar's decaying body rises from the bed to get his revenge. This is the most memorable scene from this segment, when Price undergoes all that makeup. It was said to be very uncomfortable as it was made from hot glue and cornstarch. So of all the segments, it's probably safe to say this one was the worst experience for Vincent Price. Overall, Tales of Terror is a mixed bag, but Peter Lorre's phenomenal acting in the Black Cat segment is the absolute highlight and the reason why it's one of my favorites of the whole series. Next up, the fifth installment, The Raven. Now, of course, The Raven was only a poem. There's not a whole lot you can do with it, so they basically use The Raven as a launching point into an entirely unrelated story. It starts with Vincent Price narrating the original poem. He plays a wizard named Dr. Craven who's mourning the death of his wife Lenore when a raven shows up, like in the poem. But once the poem runs out, we find in this version the raven is a human, Dr. Bedloe, who's been turned into a raven by a sorcerer's magic spell. He begs Dr. Craven to turn him back, which means he has to go into this classic dusty alchemist lab full of potions and animal bones and cobwebs. So once he turns Bedloe back into himself, guess who it is? Peter Lorre. The movie just got good.
Dr. Craven.
But it gets even better. They travel to the evil sorcerer's castle, Dr. Scarabeus, with Bedloe seeking revenge and Craven investigating the possibility of his wife still being alive and inhabiting the castle. They're joined by Craven's daughter Estelle and Bedloe's son Rexford, who's played by a young Jack Nicholson, who says in Corman's book that the Raven kept shitting on his shoulder. There is very little indication that this unassuming young actor would become one of the all-time juggernauts. It's a simple part, played straight, but there is one moment where he's under a spell and he goes into psychotic Jack mode. It may not be full Shining, but it's something. And if you thought this cast couldn't get any more star-studded, well, then look who we have here. The main villain, Scarabeus, is played by none other than Boris fucking Karloff.
Afraid, my dear? There's nothing to be afraid of.
I can't think of any other film that transcends so many generations of horror. Just think, it spans Frankenstein all the way to The Shining. Not to mention, Karloff was in the 1935 version of The Raven. When you've been around long enough to be in both versions, that's something. At this point, Karloff was not in the best of health, but he was a trooper and his performance is A+, with that sneering, two-faced, shit-eating grin.
The gift of magic by gesture.
I have my humble means.
The plot takes many twists and turns, but never mind that. Once all these actors are together, this is when the movie gets really good.
You and I of the occult dedication know only too well the deceptiveness of what appears to be.
The scene with Price, Lorre, and Karloff at the dinner table is fantastic. Dr. Bedloe is boiling over with rage and wants to challenge Scarabeus to a duel.
I challenge you!
But Scarabeus keeps trying to defuse the situation while hiding his true intentions. And Dr. Craven is just caught in the middle of it. The dynamic between these actors is incredible. It's been said that Laurie would go off script and ad-lib a lot. It goes to show because of how natural he comes off. But apparently Karloff wanted to stick to the script, and he would get annoyed when Laurie would throw him off track. So his reactions are genuine.
Yes, you are afraid, you miserable coward.
Father, in the name of...
Shut your mouth! Yes, afraid.
Peter Lorre might have had a method to legitimately get under Karloff's skin and bring out the best performance.
You pitiful old goat. Enough, sir. You shriveled up old... Enough, sir.
Scarabeus easily defeats Bedloe, and in the end, it's Kraven who has to step up. That final battle between Kraven and Scarabeus is another highlight. The special effects are super cheap and are nothing compared to what you can do on your computer or even your phone nowadays. Imagine explaining that to somebody back then. Like, hey, you can do that shit on your phone. Special effects on a telephone? How does that work? Anyway, I was never bothered by how cheap this scene looks because the idea behind it is what counts. Who doesn't love a wizard's duel? Some say this film went too far with the comedy, but I say it's super fun. For me, it's all about the actors, and it especially can't be understated how good Karloff is. For this reason alone, I'd say it's another one of my favorites, maybe even my favorite of the entire series. Next would be The Terror. However, it's not based on a specific Poe story, rather it's done in a Poe style. It fits right in with the others, but it's not generally considered to be part of the series. Also, I've reviewed it already, I've even done a feature-length commentary, so I'd be fine to pass on it, but the circumstances surrounding how it was made is such a great tale, it's worth repeating. Basically, as soon as Corman wrapped up on The Raven, he decided to film 2 extra days with Karloff for a new movie, which he didn't even have a full script for. It was a generic idea to utilize Karloff and the Raven sets before they were torn down. So he filmed 2 days with Karloff and Jack Nicholson, and then they had to figure out the rest later. Well, that turned into 9 months and 5 other directors to finish it up, including Francis Ford Coppola and even Jack Nicholson directing part of it. Each director added their own twist to the story, so in the end, it made no sense whatsoever.
The Baron did return that night to find Eric with the Baroness, and he did kill her. But there was a struggle, and in the fight, it was not Eric who died, but the Baron.
They had to do some reshoots to clear it up. There's a monologue where Dick Miller attempts to explain the entire plot while in close-up because the set was torn down by then. In fact, he's in front of the set of the next Poe film, The Haunted Palace, and also the 20 minutes of Karloff in this film was recycled to make yet another movie while shooting 20 additional minutes of Karloff, and that movie became Targets. So it's just a really funny story how it all went down. I love The Terror. It's ridiculous.
It's the only film that I defy anybody to, because there's no story actually arrived at. To this day, no one knows the plot of The Terror.
But let's get to The Haunted Palace, the official number 6 in the series. But here's the weird thing about The Haunted Palace. The Poe story was nothing more than a short poem, shorter than The Raven, so there's even less of a connection to Poe. This makes any claim that The Terror counts even more credible. The Haunted Palace actually derives its story from H.P. Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. The setting is New England colonial times in the fictional town of Arkham from Lovecraft lore. Vincent Price plays a man who is accused of being a warlock and is burned alive. Then we fast forward 110 years when his great-great-grandson, who is also played by Vincent Price, inherits the old palace. He stops by the local bar to ask directions, but the townspeople are fearful and try to force them away. They won't even tell them where the palace is, but all he has to do is look, and it's clearly visible from the bar. It definitely plays into the old Universal tropes, especially the Frankenstein sequels. The castle is always abandoned, somebody always shows up and wants to go to it, and the townspeople are always fearful, and there's mostly always a bar full of dead serious patrons. And if this didn't already feel like a color remake of a Universal film, when they arrive at the palace, guess who they meet? Lon Chaney Jr.
Good evening.
He plays the creepy old caretaker who is secretly carrying out orders to resurrect his master. They don't give Chaney much to do. All he does is sneak up and accidentally scare people all the time. Chaney was past his prime here, but it's still nice to see him. In a nutshell, it's a story of possession. The ancestor inhabits the body of the descendant, that sort of thing. But it's all style over story. Like I said, it follows all the universal tropes, right down to the villagers carrying torches and storming the castle. And of course, everything burns down in the end. The atmosphere is stellar. There is a copious amount of fog, which you know I love. Foggy streets, foggy forests, foggy cemeteries. Hell, the fog even comes inside. This is one where the visual aspect keeps it interesting, though it does feel like the Poe theme has run its course, especially if they had to give up on it and go Lovecraft instead. Seventh in the franchise is Mask of the Red Death. This one seemed like a sure winner because the original story is one of Poe's best. It's a good one to read out loud. It has a lot of great visual descriptions, especially when they go through all the different colored rooms, ending up in the foreboding black room with the red windows. It makes you wonder why they didn't adapt this into a film earlier, but Corman says the reason was that he didn't want it to be compared to The Seventh Seal, 1957. That film also involved a plague and a hooded, robed figure known as Death, so Corman decided to wait a little. Red Death is set in medieval times. Vincent Price plays Prince Prospero, who's depicted as a cruel devil worshipper. While a plague is wiping out the countryside, he retreats into his castle and hosts a lavish party. Also, there's a subplot taken from another Poe story, Hop Frog, though here they call the character Hop Toad. He and Esmeralda are entertainers who are mistreated by one of Prospero's guests, Alfredo. And just like in the Poe story, Hop Toad enacts his revenge. But it's kind of strange how it plays out on film. Hop Toad convinces Alfredo to show up at the masked ball in an ape suit. I mean, he hardly questions it. He just decides to go along with it. And then all Hop Toad has to do is tie him up to a chandelier, douse him with alcohol, and then set him ablaze. Nobody stops him. Nobody does a thing. They all just watch this man burn to death. It's incredibly awkward, but maybe that's part of the charm. Also, the famous finale where the Red Death crashes the party and makes everybody dead is very surreal. He just makes their skin turn bloody red and they continue dancing. It's really bizarre. Overall, you have Vincent Price in a devilishly sinister role, you have great set designs, creepy visuals, it has all the necessities. But there's something about this installment that separates it from the others in the series. I could never put my finger on it, but it might have something to do with the fact that it was filmed in England rather than Hollywood. Some of the castle sets were left over from Beckett, a historical drama. And also, a fun fact, the Beatles were just starting to get big at the time. Corman wasn't really aware, but he was introduced to some important guy who showed up at the set. So Corman gave him a tour, and it turned out the guy was Paul McCartney. Yeah, Paul McCartney was on the set of Mask of the Red Death.
Let me see your face.
I'm not sure where Red Death ranks in the Corman Poe series. I used to think it was one of the best, but after watching them all in a row, I'm starting to think it's actually one of the weaker ones. Maybe it's just fatigue. Maybe it's that I've been spoiled with Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff. But even Vincent Price is better in the earlier ones. The atmosphere and visuals are better in the others too. So overall, I still think it's a good film, but compared with some of the others, it doesn't really stand out. But the final film, number 8 in the series, might be the most forgettable. However, it's loosely based on one of the most interesting Poe stories, Tomb of Ligeia, or just Ligeia as the original story is called. It deals with death and reincarnation. A woman dies and comes back in the body of another woman, which is a fundamental type of story that's been retold one way or another in countless films, from The Mummy to Vertigo. The film follows the same basic premise. Vincent Price plays Verdun. The reason he wears those weird sunglasses is because he has an eye condition making him extra sensitive to light, almost a throwback to his Roderick Usher character. His wife, Ligeia, dies. He feels her spirit never went to rest, he marries another woman, And then Lygea's spirit comes back, although in the film, she is more vengeful and he has to fight against her. They also feel the need to throw in a black cat because we never had that before. It's implied that her spirit is in the cat and it attacks Verdun. And in the end, guess what happens? Just take a wild guess. Everything burns down. Man, it seems Vincent Price was always in a burning building, even going back to House of Wax. It must have felt like business as usual. Gotta act in the fucking fire again. One thing that stands out with Tomb of Ligeia is that they use a lot of real locations. The main castle is called Acre Priory, located in England. There's many daytime scenes where you can see all the stone and rubble, so while it's nice to see indoor sets, it's also cool to see real-life places. They even have a short scene at Stonehenge.
No, we're not gonna fucking do Stonehenge!
In conclusion, the formula may have worn thin, but after 8 movies, it still has a lot of appeal. Some count The Oblong Box as the final entry in the Poe films because it has Vincent Price and it's an AIP film, but it wasn't directed by Roger Corman or had anything to do with him. If you want to talk about any Poe adaptation to have Vincent Price, well, check out An Evening of Edgar Allan Poe. It's just Vincent Price all by himself performing Poe stories in these giant theatrical monologues. If you want to see Vincent Price at full power, check out the Telltale Heart segment.
I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him.
Yeah, if you want to know how good of an actor Vincent Price really is, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe, I highly recommend it.
God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting.
Well, that was a marathon. Remember when Monster Madness videos used to be only 2 minutes long? Well, I gave you a big bonus here. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this retrospective of Corman's Poe series. If you've seen them already, or if you're thinking to check them out, I hope I helped guide you on the right path.